Welcome to a place where history isn't just remembered, but relived moments frozen in time, waiting to pull us away from the chaos of modern life. You're standing beneath vaulted ceilings of whitewash stone torchlight, flickering along the walls as the court of King Henry VIII hums with movement. Silks rustle, spiced perfumes waft from the sleeves of noblewomen, and somewhere nearby a lute player stumbles slightly on a note, but continues as if nothing happened. You're not royalty, not quite, but you've been granted a front row seat to one of the most watched flirtations in Tudor England. The curious unfolding between a powerful king and the sharp-eyed lady-in-waiting who would not play by the rules. The air smells faintly of beeswax and damp wool. You shift your weight court shoes weren't made for comfort and glance across the crowded hall. That's when you notice her Anne Boleyn, not yet a queen, not even officially a mistress. She's just watching. A velvet sleeve brushes against your arm. Her dark eyes lock with the king's across the room. And that's where the trouble begins. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also post your location and local time. We've got night owls tuning in from everywhere. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail behind Anne trying to keep a low profile. That's easier said than done, considering the heaving skirts and the fact that every servant seems to be whispering behind their hands. She's not the kind of woman people overlook. Not because of any conventional beauty by court standards. She's a little too dark, too angular, too foreign in her French-styled elegance, but because she moves like she already owns the place. Historians still argue whether it was love at first sight or a long, calculated game. What's clearer is that Henry VIII had already grown bored of his previous flirtation, Anne's sister Mary Boleyn, who had warmed his bed and bored his mind. Anne, by contrast, offered no easy access, no coy simpering. When the king sent her a gift, she returned it. When he invited her to his chambers, she declined. With a curtsy, of course. Always a curtsy. This wasn't just hard to get. This was Tudor-level jujitsu. You don't refuse a king unless you're trying to change history. At this point, Anne wasn't particularly powerful. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a well-connected diplomat, and her uncle was the Duke of Norfolk, a man who looked like he'd been carved from ambition and vinegar. But Anne herself had just returned from serving in the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France, where she'd learned how to read people almost as well as she read books. In a world where literacy was rare for women, Anne could, quote, scripture, compose music, and debate politics, then flash a knowing smile as if to say, yes, I did just out-argue your theology tutor in front of the whole dining hall. You're there the evening Henry first tries real conversation with her. They're at a masquerade, the room dizzy with incense and laughter. The king dressed like a shepherd. Yes, a shepherd. Someone had to remind him that his calves were showing leans toward her and murmurs something. Anne pauses, then replies just loud enough for a few people to hear, "Your grace plays the shepherd well. Though I pity the sheep." Cue awkward chuckles, and one noble choking slightly on a grape. From that moment on, she has his attention, not just his eye, but his curiosity. And soon, his obsession. You observe him pacing more often his royal temper, fraying at council meetings. He asks where Anne is, who she's talking to, whether she looked pleased or weary this morning. He starts composing letters not dictated, but handwritten pages filled with clumsy metaphors and yearning. One such letter includes a jewel, a heart-shaped ruby nestled in golden filigree. Anne returns it, politely, with a note about virtue and God and patience. Another includes a lock of Henry's own hair. That one she doesn't return, but she does show it to her friends and laugh for a full minute. Apparently, royal dandruff isn't so different from everyone else's. Now the court begins to notice. Whispered bets are placed. How long until she gives in? How long until the queen is sent away? How long until the king explodes and banishes her to a convent? None of these turn out to be quite right, of course, but you'd understand why they'd think it. Because while Henry is consumed, Anne is calculating. She knows what happens to women who surrender too early. Her sister Mary had been the king's darling for about 3 dances and a single spring season. Now she was married off to a minor noble and basically lived in the countryside tending chickens and being forgotten. Anne doesn't want that. She wants more. So she waits. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon, the actual queen, goes about her life with dignity and discomfort. You might expect fireworks or fainting spells, but Catherine, daughter of Spanish royalty, widow of Henry's brother before she married Henry himself, is made of sterner stuff. She prays. A lot. She weaves tapestries of biblical scenes that start to feel more and more pointed. One featured Judith beheading Holofernes, and you swear the soldier's tunic looks suspiciously like Henry's. One quirky tidbit: Anne apparently enjoyed playing the lute at night in her chambers, and deliberately plucking slightly out of tune chords whenever Catherine walked past. Petty, yes. Effective. Also, yes. The court grows tense. Jesters start skipping certain jokes. One poor fool makes a pun involving crowns and bedsheets and is never seen again. A pigeon flies into the chapel during Mass and lands squarely on Anne's head. Some say it's a sign, others say the pigeon just had bad depth perception. You meanwhile are starting to see just how dangerously tight this triangle is becoming. Henry is falling, Anne is maneuvering, and Catherine is enduring. Everyone's watching, everyone's waiting. Even the walls seem to lean in, hoping to catch the next whispered promise or biting remark. And you're right there with them. Slowly blinking, slightly drowsy, wondering what it must have felt like to walk that thin, jeweled edge between power, passion, and peril. You blink slowly, still lingering near the edge of that bustling Tudor court, where shadows stretch long in torchlight, and everyone's eyes seem to be on someone else's secrets. You hear the soft scrape of shoes over rush-strewn floors as the game between Henry and Anne begins to sharpen. It's no longer courtly banter or chivalrous compliments, it's strategy now. The kind of chess where queens are removed with silk gloves and smiles. You find yourself beside Anne again, though really she notices no one unless she needs to. Her attention is focused entirely on the king and the power he wields, but only in the long term. She has no intention of becoming his mistress. That's a game for women with fewer ambitions. Anne wants to be his wife, and she's not shy about it. Henry, meanwhile, has the energy of a teenager who has just discovered his crush is both unavailable and extremely clever. He's sending gifts rings, books puppies. Yes, royal lapdogs were an actual thing, and one peculiar brooch shaped like a bleeding heart. Anne responds with carefully penned thank you notes and the occasional verbal dagger. At one banquet, when Henry offers to seat her beside him, she smiles and says, "Your Majesty honors me. But would the Queen approve?" Oh! The entire table freezes. One fork clatters to the floor. Somewhere, someone stops chewing mid-goose leg. Anne doesn't flinch. She just lifts her goblet and toasts to virtue. Mainstream historical fact. We have no exact date for when their flirtation began, but most historians peg the serious escalation to around 1526. Henry was in his mid-30s, increasingly desperate for a male heir, and already growing frustrated with the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine. But at this point in your sleepy little shadow tour, it's still just sparks and dry straw. No fire yet, not quite. Anne begins playing the long game in public. No more private audiences, no late-night visits, no suggestive looks, at least not ones she can't explain away. Instead, she starts leaning into the politics. She joins in theological discussions. She flirts politely with reformist ideas. She makes sure she's seen talking with men like Thomas Cranmer, a quiet scholar who believes controversially that maybe kings don't need papal permission for everything. And yet for all her control, she has moments. One fringe tidbit: Anne once dropped a note intended for Henry during a public masque performance. It landed squarely in the lap of the French ambassador who, not reading English, handed it directly to Henry anyway. Close call or perfectly choreographed accident. Henry, meanwhile, becomes increasingly erratic. He begins designing Anne's motto, "The most happy," before she's even agreed to anything. He commissions portraits of her with little cupids in the background. One time he has her initials embroidered on his doublet sleeve, and his wife notices. Speaking of Catherine, she's still very much around. She refuses to step aside. She reminds the court and the clergy that she was married to Henry's brother with papal permission, and that her marriage to Henry has also been confirmed by Rome. If the Pope approved it, then only the Pope can unapprove it. This, unfortunately, is a problem. The Pope Clement VII is currently being held hostage in Rome by Emperor Charles V, who just so happens to be Catherine's nephew. It's giving no divorce for you, dear king. Historians still argue whether Anne truly believed Henry would marry her, or if she was simply pushing the game until it became impossible to walk away. What's clear is that by 1527, Anne had become both a symbol and a scandal. Poets wrote verses about her eyes, her voice, her laugh. Scribes passed around increasingly spicy rumors. You hear one under a colonnade that she's a witch, that she has 6 fingers that her blood sings at midnight. In reality, her so-called 6th finger was likely just a minor nail deformity. But never let a good ghost story get in the way of Tudor gossip. You're near the gardens when Henry corners her again, this time without an audience. He pleads, he paces, he offers to make her a duchess. She turns her face away. My honor, she says, shall not be a thing granted between sheets. That one stings. The king storms off. For a few days things are quiet. Anne keeps to her rooms reading Tyndale's banned English Bible and writing long letters to her family. Henry sulks. He hunts. He impales a wild boar with unnecessary force and returns looking smug but unfulfilled. Then he writes her another letter, his longest yet. In it he confesses that he's asked the Pope to annul his marriage, that he dreams of her by night and by mass, that he would give up his crown if it meant making her his queen. Anne folds the letter twice and tucks it into her sleeve. She doesn't write back. But the next morning she wears Henry's jeweled hairpin in her bonnet. And the entire court knows exactly what that means. You trail after her through the corridor as the walls hum with whispered guesses. Will she accept him soon? Will the Pope bend? Will Catherine be sent away? Every noble house is watching. Every minor lord is choosing sides, Boleyn or Aragon. One quirky aside during this time, Henry commissions an elaborate tapestry showing a unicorn breaking free from a golden chain. Court insiders nod knowingly. Subtlety is not this king's strong suit. And still Anne waits, and still Henry fumes, and still Catherine prays. And you keep walking these halls watching the tension rise like bread too long in the oven. You hear it in the way the courtiers pause their laughter when Anne enters. You see it in Henry's shifting moods. One day he's smitten, the next he's wrathful. One minute he's reading love sonnets, the next he's barking orders at his council. It's not a question of if this will boil over, it's just a question of when. And in the meantime, you stay close, quiet as breath, soft as velvet, watching the match flare brighter, not knowing yet what it will cost. The palace grows quieter, but it's the uneasy quiet before a thunderstorm. You drift through the long, echoing halls where candles burn low and courtiers now speak in half sentences, never quite finishing their thoughts. Everyone senses something shifting. Henry's obsession with Anne is no longer a private affair, and the kingdom can feel the ground giving way beneath its feet. You find Henry at his desk by candlelight. He's hunched over parchment, his brow furrowed so deeply it looks like a new topographical map of England. The air smells of beeswax, ink, and male desperation. He's writing another letter, his ninth this week. It's not dictated. It's not edited. These are his raw thoughts, scribbled in his own distinctive hand, filled with yearning and uneven Latin quotes. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Nearly 20 of Henry's letters to Anne survive. They're full of overwrought emotion, amateur poetry, and the kind of late-night thoughts usually found in teenage diaries. In one, he calls her his mistress and friend, swearing he has been now above a year struck with the dart of love. Anne, true to form, responds when she wants how she wants. Sometimes she praises his devotion. Sometimes she deflects with elegant scripture. Sometimes she simply ignores him. One of the most intriguing of these letters includes a drawing. A heart pierced by an arrow nestled inside a knot with their initials. Subtle he is not. You trail her down a spiral staircase one day as she clutches one of his letters in her gloved hand. She's smiling, but it's the tight-lipped smile of someone who's just realized they've become more important than they wanted to be. Power is thrilling until it becomes responsibility. And Anne is now dancing with a man who controls a kingdom and is willing to break that kingdom to possess her. Fringe tidbit Anna sometimes annotated the margins of Henry's letters not with love notes but with grammar corrections. Apparently, even kings misuse subjunctives. Tough crowd. You settle into a window alcove one morning as Anne reads aloud to her ladies-in-waiting. It's a passage from a French love manual, something light and almost comedic. They laugh, sip watered wine, and pretend not to notice that several of the metaphors sound exactly like Henry's last attempt at seduction. It's around this time Henry starts pushing harder for a solution to his great matter, the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. He's convinced that his lack of a male heir is divine punishment for having married his brother's widow. And he has scripture to prove it, or at least cherry-picked verses that conveniently support his point. Anne naturally encourages this interpretation. She's not passive in this process. Historians still argue whether her influence was religious, political, or entirely self-serving. Likely all three. She champions the cause of reform, supports English translations of the Bible, and increasingly surrounds herself with thinkers who question papal authority. Meanwhile, Henry's letters to the Pope grow more insistent, more pompous, and less coherent. At one point, he threatens to pursue other remedies if Rome won't grant his annulment. You get the sense that this isn't just about love anymore, it's about control, legacy, and proving he's more than just a puppet in the hands of foreign priests. And all the while, Anne waits. Not silently, though. She's reshaping the court in her image. She wears French-cut gowns, speaks openly of reform, and has the Queen's old ladies reassigned to distant posts. Catherine notices. Everyone notices. One courtier, a bold fool named George Cavendish, quips that Anne isn't the sun. Henry orbits, she's the eclipse. He's exiled for that one. Possibly poisoned later. Tutor, banter, high stakes. Quirky detail you'll like. Henry once sent Anne a diamond-studded chessboard with her initials etched into every square. She returned it with a single pawn missing. The message: checkmate's not yours yet. But here's where the energy shifts, and it's no longer just about Anne and Henry. The court divides into factions. You hear murmurs of Boleyn sympathizers and arrogant loyalists. Families align. Bishoprics shift. The nobility begins hedging bets. Anne isn't merely a court flirt anymore, she's a political axis. Catherine, for her part, refuses to go quietly. She insists she's Henry's lawful wife and England's rightful queen. She writes to the Pope, to Charles V, to anyone who will listen. Her supporters spread stories that Anne is unnatural, possibly cursed. One whispered tale says she carries a tiny copy of the Devil's Psalter sewn into her bodice. Another says she owns a black cat that talks. You've seen the cat. It's just a cat. But perception matters more than truth now. One evening, Henry orders a full theological review of his marriage. He gathers bishops, lawyers, scholars, and clerks into a hall that smells of wet parchment and ego. Anne is nowhere near this meeting, but somehow her presence is felt in every argument. You lean against a cold pillar, half listening as a bishop argues the meaning of uncleanness in Leviticus. The debate rages for hours. In the end, it's inconclusive. And she throws a small dinner party that night with roast duck French music and casual discussions about excommunication. It's not until the Pope formally refuses to annul Henry's marriage that things truly snap. Henry, furious beyond reason, turns to Plan B, rejecting papal authority altogether. He begins laying the groundwork for a radical idea, making himself supreme head of the Church of England. You're there when he speaks the words for the first time softly to a handful of trusted men. If Rome will not grant what is mine by right, he says, then I shall become Rome. Chilling. Anne for once is quiet that night. She walks the gardens under a rising moon, her cloak brushing frost from the grass. You follow breath visible in the cold air, and you wonder if even she knows how far this will go. Because now it's not just a love affair, it's not just court gossip or religious doctrine. Now it's war. And the battlefield is marriage. You open your eyes to the rustle of satin and the faint sound of chapel bells echoing through a palace that now feels strangely rearranged. Something has shifted not just in the court, but in the air itself. A scent of finality, of things being set into motion that cannot be reversed. Catherine is still in the palace, but not at the king's side. You don't see her anymore at banquets or processions. She's been moved to more distant quarters, her household quietly reduced, her titles left to dangle awkwardly in conversation. No one's quite sure what to call her now. Some whisper Princess Dowager. Others more loyal still say Queen Catherine with deliberate clarity. You trail after Anne through a long gallery, the light slanting low over the floor. She walks with unmistakable confidence, flanked by her ladies, each chosen not for loyalty to the crown, but loyalty to her. She wears brighter colors now, crimson saffron, deep emerald, like she's no longer waiting to be noticed, but expects to be remembered. The flirtation has become an affair, but not the kind whispered behind fans and carried out in locked chambers. No, this is a tactical, choreographed courtship with paperwork, Latin prayers, and legal implications that would make a papal scribe faint. They haven't slept together yet, but the implication grows louder each day. Mainstream historical fact. Henry's pursuit of annulment began in earnest in 1527 and dragged on for 6 long years. During this time, Catherine refused every request to step aside, and Anne remained unmarried to preserve the possibility of becoming queen. She knew that if she became a mistress, in name it was all over. So she held fast, tight-lipped and calculating while Henry squirmed under Rome's refusal. Fringe tidbit. One of Henry's early legal strategies involved arguing that his conscience had been troubled for years over the moral error of marrying his brother's widow. The awkward part, he'd already lived happily with Catherine for over 2 decades. It's hard to claim moral unease when you've shared that many roast goose dinners and Christmases. You're at a royal hunt one afternoon. Henry's favorite distraction. The hounds bay the horns blast and the king charges into the forest like he's chasing something bigger than a stag. Anne doesn't hunt, not really. She rides alongside dressed in a tight bodice and a hat tilted just so, and she watches him. Always watches him. They stop for a meal under canvas tents. Henry sits beside her now, not across from her. Catherine's chair sits empty. Anne peels an apple and offers him a slice. He takes it like it's communion. You can feel the tension even in the shadows. The nobles smile, but their eyes flick constantly. Who's seen sitting where? Who's laughing too loudly? Who's suddenly lost their appetite? One nobleman coughs violently after sipping wine and blames it on the air. He's reassigned to Calais within a week. Historians still argue whether Anne loved Henry or merely endured him for power. Some point to her letters and soft phrases. Others cite her eye rolls, her quick temper, and her growing impatience. Love or strategy, maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe just survival Tudor style. Meanwhile, Thomas Wolsey, Henry's once mighty chief minister, scrambles to keep up. He's promised to secure the annulment from Rome, but the Pope remains caged by Charles V, who you may recall is Catherine's very annoyed nephew. So, Wolsey juggles prayers, threats, diplomacy, and at least 3 rounds of wine per negotiation. Anne grows cold toward Wolsey. She sees him as too loyal to Catherine, too slow, too soft. You overhear her one day muttering that the cardinal's head is stuffed with old parchment and stale pride. Harsh, accurate. Quirky tidbit. Anne once had a small decorative coin engraved with a falcon, her personal symbol, perched atop a Tudor rose. Beneath it, in Latin, the phrase, "the most happy." It wasn't just a motto, it was a prophecy carved in silver. You're beside Henry again one night as he stares at his own reflection in a darkened window. He's begun to gray at the temples. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like feeling mortal. He mutters something about needing a son, about God's will, about dynasties and divine punishment. His voice catches. And then he says her name. Not Anne, not Mistress Boleyn. Just her. He sends a message the next morning. If the Pope will not annul his marriage, he will declare it invalid himself. He will marry Anne, and he will make England answer only to its king. You are there hidden behind a carved wooden screen when Henry tells his council. The gasps aren't loud, but they're sharp. One lord faints, though later insists it was low blood sugar. There is no thunderclap, no scream, just a widening silence. Because this is the moment where love and religion crash into governance. Anne's rise is no longer theoretical. She's not a mistress. She's not a scandal. She's the future queen of a newly formed church, one that answers to the crown instead of the cross. Catherine is told at last that her marriage is null. She refuses to accept it. She's escorted out of court with quiet dignity, holding a rosary and a copy of the Pope's last letter. She kisses a crucifix, blesses her household, and leaves. You watch her go wrapped in black velvet and unbroken. Back inside, Anne sits in the Queen's seat for the first time, and nobody moves to stop her. The light in the palace feels different now, sharper, colder. As you drift through the corridors, you notice how the laughter is quieted, how the musicians tune their lutes with more caution than joy. It's not that Anne Boleyn has become queen, not officially, but she no longer walks behind anyone. And Catherine. She's gone exiled to a damp estate, her name dropped from prayers, her presence folded away like yesterday's silk. Enter Thomas Wolsey, still clinging to relevance with white-knuckle determination. You watch him from across the council chamber, sweat pooling at his collar, as he bows before Henry, offering yet another legal workaround. His fingers shake as he fumbles his parchments, mumbling phrases like dispensation and canonical error and regrettable delay. You know what's coming, even if he doesn't. The king is not a patient man, especially not now. Not when Anne stands waiting radiant and silent like a loaded crossbow. Mainstream historical fact. In 1529, Wolsey was officially stripped of his title as Lord Chancellor and sent into exile. His failure to secure the annulment from Rome was the last straw. But for months prior, his influence had already been eroding, one clipped nod from Anne at a banquet, one cold glance from Henry during morning mass. One fringe detail Wolsey, in a last-ditch effort, tried to appeal to Henry by organizing an elaborate banquet in Anne's honor. He hired musicians, poets, and even a trained parrot that squawked, "God save Queen Anne," every third hour. It was not effective. Anne laughed once, then had the bird removed. You see Wolsey for the last time as he boards a barge at dawn, red robes dulled by fog. His eyes scan the palace windows, hoping for one last look from the king. None comes. You wonder if he's praying, or plotting, or just cold. Meanwhile, Anne's family rises like ivy on a crumbling wall. Thomas Boleyn is now Earl of Wiltshire. Her brother George, bold, clever, and always one smirk away from scandal, becomes Lord Rochford. They host dinners, sponsor plays, and walk the court with a confidence so thick it's practically perfumed. Anne herself remains surprisingly restrained. You follow her into the chapel one morning expecting to see her triumphant, but she kneels, hands clasped, lips murmuring something inaudible. Maybe she's praying, maybe she's practicing. Queens must do both. Historians still argue whether Anne's ambitions were driven by faith or fire. Some claim she was a secret Protestant long before Henry ever considered reform. Others insist her religious leanings were more fashionable than devout. What's known is that she owned several banned books and once smuggled a copy of Tyndale's English Bible into court, hidden inside a velvet-lined box meant for jewels. Quirky tidbit. Anne began gifting her ladies personalized prayer books, each inscribed with a variation of her new motto, "The Most Happy." One of them also contained a cartoon doodle of a pope falling off a horse. Tasteful number qui effective vary, and yet the mood remains unstable. You sit through a dinner at Whitehall where courtiers toast to our beloved future queen, but their smiles are stiff, their eyes elsewhere. No one knows how this ends. Will Rome retaliate? Will Spain invade? Will Henry change his mind tomorrow, as he did with that ugly portrait of his last favorite jester? Henry is both euphoric and unsettled. He rides harder, prays longer, drinks more. He's building something massive, a new order, a new church, a new wife, and he needs everyone to pretend it's all going according to plan. But the cracks show. One evening, Anne hosts a masque in her new apartments. The theme is spring's triumph over winter. Dancers in flowered tunics twirl around figures draped in black. The message is clear. Catherine, winter. Anne, ice, spring. It's subtle as a war drum. Henry watches enchanted. His eyes follow Anne's every step. When she laughs, he laughs. When she claps, he claps harder. And when she kisses his cheek in view of the entire court, the nobles cheer. But you notice one bishop swallow hard before raising his goblet. You wander the palace that night as candlelight flickers against walls painted with roses and falcons. Anne's symbols. Anne's future. But nothing in this palace is ever fully safe. Not really. There are murmurs. Some say Anne is too proud, that she has enemies, that she's not royal born, that her French manners hide something darker. A few whisper she keeps jars of herbs in her room concoctions, maybe meant to ensure fertility, or maybe just to ease her nerves. Henry doesn't care, or at least he pretends not to. He's focused now on a coronation, not just marriage, a full formal crowning of Anne Boleyn as Queen of England. And not just any queen, but one blessed by God, unmarred by papal politics, radiant in gold and legitimacy. You see him pacing his study late one night, his fingers tapping the windowsill. "She must be crowned," he mutters, "like no other." He says this over and over, like no other. It becomes his mantra, and soon plans are drawn, jewels ordered, tapestries commissioned, a golden barge prepared. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. For now you return to the quiet edges of Anne's chambers, where a woman who once stood beside the queen now is the queen in all but name. She looks out across the dark lawn, her silhouette framed by flickering candlelight. Her expression is unreadable. Perhaps it's triumph. Perhaps it's fear. Or maybe it's just exhaustion. She's played the game to the end and won. Or so it seems. You awaken still here, still quietly haunting these velvet-draped halls, as the Boleyn crest appears embroidered on more sleeves than you remember. The Lion of England hasn't vanished, but now it rubs shoulders with Anne's falcon crowned and proud. The palace breathes differently now. The scent of politics hangs heavier than ever. But beneath it something else lingers, fear sweetened with opportunity. You drift past a long row of portraits Catherine's has been removed. No one speaks of it, but everyone noticed. A new one of Anne is being painted slowly, stroke by loving stroke. The artist mutters about her cheekbones, her clever mouth, her eyes that see too much. He's not wrong. Those eyes miss nothing. Inside the council chamber, Henry is practically glowing. He's made his choice, and he will not be contradicted. The Church of England is now a living thing, freshly minted in defiance of Rome. The king is its supreme head. The Reformation in England has begun not because of Martin Luther or theological purity, but because one man couldn't take no for an answer. Mainstream, historical fact. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, recently appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and his marriage to Anne fully valid. It was an unprecedented move, one that triggered fury across Europe and shivers across the English clergy. But here in London, the show must go on. Anne is now visibly pregnant. The race is on. She and Henry must marry before the bump becomes unhideable, and they must crown her before Europe has time to respond. So they do it in secret. You're there floating unseen like the flicker of a forgotten candle when Henry and Anne wed in a quiet ceremony in January 1533. No grand procession, no choirs, just a few trusted witnesses, a bishop with a steady hand, and the unmistakable silence of something irreversible. Fringe tidbit. Anne's gown was white, not yet a bridal tradition, but an intentional symbol of purity. Irony, maybe. Statement, definitely. And it looked stunning against her jet-dark hair. The secret wedding ripples outward. There's an official announcement weeks later carefully phrased to suggest this union is both sacred and fated. Not everyone is convinced. You pass a bishop in the hallway muttering blasphemy under his breath. A nobleman clutches his rosary tighter than usual. A letter from Catherine arrives unsigned, filled with scripture and sorrow. Henry reads it once and burns it. Anne, for her part, is now treated like royalty. No longer Mistress Boleyn. No longer the king's friend. She's Queen Anne, and she insists on the title being used aloud. You hear her correct a lady-in-waiting one morning, her tone mild, her gaze lethal. But with the crown comes the crown's weight. Enemies multiply. You watch them gather, old noble families loyal to Catherine, conservative bishops unwilling to denounce Rome, scheming courtiers who hedge their bets like merchants juggling debts. They smile at Anne in the corridor but whisper in corners, exchange notes in code, and count the days until she stumbles. And she might. Because despite her wit, her position, her dazzling rise, Anne has made powerful enemies. And she's pregnant. And this baby has to be a boy. The pressure is unbearable. You hover in her chamber as midwives check her pulse, whisper predictions, and adjust pillows embroidered with the Tudor rose and falcon. Henry visits daily now, pacing the length of the room, babbling about omens and stars and the royal astrologer's new chart. Historians still argue whether Anne's pregnancy sped up the religious changes or simply coincided with them. One thing's certain, had she not been carrying the king's child, the marriage likely would have taken far longer to formalize. But formalize it did. Plans for Anne's coronation begin almost immediately. You drift into the royal treasury where tailors unroll bolts of cloth of gold and jewelers polish imported rubies. Henry spares no expense. Anne will not be just crowned, she will be exalted. Quirky tidbit. Anne insisted that her coronation include a traditional royal bath ritual. Yes, a literal public bath in a gold-trimmed tub because it was part of medieval tradition. The symbolism cleansing the body to match the purity of the crown. You watch as courtiers awkwardly attend, trying not to make eye contact while pretending to admire the tilework. The actual procession is something else entirely. You stand along the riverbank, the crowd pressing in around you as Anne rides a barge gilded in gold leaf. Banners snap in the wind, trumpets blare. Anne sits beneath a canopy, her belly slightly rounded, her expression serene but sharp. She wears a robe so heavy she can barely move. It takes 2 pages just to hold her train. As she floats toward Westminster, the crowds cheer, but not all. You hear boos scattered and quickly silenced. Some throw flowers, some turn their backs, but the point is made. Anne is crowned Queen of England in June 1533. Not as a consort, but with full ceremony with St. Edward's crown reserved for reigning monarchs. She's the first queen to receive it. She might be the last. You stand beside the coronation platform, the scent of incense thick as thunderclouds. Her hands don't tremble. Not once. Henry looks at her like she's the sun. Like this was always meant to be. The Boleyns celebrate, the reformers rejoice, the court bows. But beneath all that gold and glory, there's still a single truth, thrumming like a plucked string in the dark. Everything now depends on the baby. You're in the palace gardens now, the midsummer air, thick with the scent of lavender and rosewater. But the fragrance can't mask the tension tightening around the court like a slowly cinching bodice. The coronation is complete. Anne is Queen of England. Henry, flushed with self-righteous triumph, has rewritten the rules of monarchy and religion, and now everyone waits, because while trumpets and pageantry might dazzle the people, only one thing will prove Anne's legitimacy. The child must be a boy, a living boy, preferably chubby and healthy and screaming at full volume. You linger in her chambers where velvet drapes filter the light, and every piece of furniture has been repositioned by physicians to promote optimal humoral balance. The physicians argue over whether she should drink warm milk or avoid pears. One recommends singing to the fetus in Latin. Another insists she not cross her ankles. Anne tolerates all of it, barely. Mainstream historical fact. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gives birth not to a prince but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Not stillborn, not sickly, but unmistakably, irrevocably female. And just like that, the kingdom exhales in disappointment. Henry tries to hide it. He issues announcements anyway. Orders bonfires lit. Declares the child legitimate. But there's a flicker in his face you recognize now. The same look he had when Wolsey failed him. When a hawk missed its mark, when Anne first told him no. That look never ends well. Anne names the girl Elizabeth not after Henry's mother, but her own. A quiet defiance. And you see the pride in her eyes when she holds the infant for the first time. But pride can't drown out the murmurs. One bishop whispers that this is a sign from God. One noble jokes that Henry's arrow shoots only daughters. He's exiled by sunrise. Fringe tidbit Elizabeth's christening was still an enormous affair. Trumpets, velvet robes, gold-embroidered towels. Anne wore a crimson gown, stitched with 2,000 pearls as if she could dress her disappointment into submission. But it doesn't work. Not fully. You hear it in the hallways, the coughs that pause when Anne walks by, the eye contact that's just a little too fleeting. The Boleyn faction begins to thin. Their enemies grow braver, their allies quieter. Still, Anne refuses to retreat. She dives deeper into her queenship. She oversees palace renovations. She curates her court's fashion. She selects her own ladies-in-waiting, surrounding herself with reformers and poets and sharp-tongued friends. You follow her one morning to her library where she reads aloud from Tyndale while a kitten dozes in the sun. It should be peaceful, but her voice shakes on certain lines, especially the ones about kings and wrath and women who bear sons. Henry grows distant. At first it's just shorter visits, then it's longer hunting trips, then whispers about a new lady-in-waiting blonde, soft-spoken Jane something, Jane Seymour. You file the name away. Historians still argue whether Henry's affection for Anne faded because of Elizabeth or because of Anne herself. She was witty, bold, and unafraid to disagree with him, qualities that made her irresistible as a mistress and inconvenient as a wife. One night you find Henry alone in the chapel staring at a candle. He mutters something about dynasty and God's will. You lean closer and hear, perhaps this was a mistake. He doesn't say her name. He doesn't have to. Anne senses the shift. You can see it in how she starts counting conversations. Who spoke to her first? Who avoided her eyes? Who mentioned the name Jane at dinner? Quirky detail: Anne once ordered a tapestry that depicted the biblical Queen Esther, clever, brave, and beautiful, pleading for her people before the king. It hung behind her throne, subtle messaging with a touch of desperation. Still, she pushes forward. She becomes patron of universities, churches, and hospitals. She presses Henry to support poor relief and educational reform. She writes letters to Protestant thinkers abroad, and when Henry dismisses complaints, she reminds him politely at first that she gave up everything for him. And he nods. And he kisses her hand, and he still doesn't sleep beside her as often as he used to. You're in the gallery during one of their last truly happy moments. They're watching a group of musicians play a French ballad. Elizabeth gurgles in a basket nearby. Henry chuckles at something Anne says. She reaches for his hand. For a moment it feels like the beginning again. Then he glances toward the far end of the room. Jane Seymour stands there, silent, modest, watching. Anne sees it, and the moment dies. You follow her back to her chamber, where she kicks off her shoes and hurls a silver mirror into the fire. It doesn't break. It just melts slowly, stubbornly, refusing to shatter. Much like her, you return to the palace as the leaves outside begin to brown and fall, drifting across cobbled courtyards like confetti from a forgotten celebration. Inside, the atmosphere is brittle. You can feel it in the clatter of boots, the dry coughs of courtiers, the way laughter now ends too quickly. Something's changed. Something's closing in. Anne's smile doesn't reach her eyes anymore. You follow her through corridors she once glided through. Now she walks faster, her shoulders tighter. Her ladies whisper more often, glancing behind them, even when no one is there. You hear them mention Jane in hushed tones. Jane Seymour is no longer just a name. She's a presence, Henry is absent more often now. He claims to be hunting overseeing churches managing royal revenues, but really he's escaping from what even he might not be sure: guilt, disappointment, or just the dawning sense that he has once again tethered himself to a woman who won't give him a son. Mainstream historical fact: Anne Boleyn suffered a miscarriage in January 1536. The child by most accounts was a boy lost in the 4th month of pregnancy. The timing could not have been worse. Catherine of Aragon had just died. Henry's grief was already volatile, and now Anne had failed him at the very moment he expected to be vindicated. You are there unseen but near when Anne collapses. She'd just argued with Henry about Jane, a fight behind closed doors that left both of them shouting. Later that day, blood, panic, silence, fringe detail. Some sources claim Anne's miscarriage occurred on the very day of Catherine's funeral. Eerie coincidence or divine rebuke depends on who you ask. The clergy saw it as God's judgment. Anne saw it as the beginning of the end. In the days after, the palace feels like a mausoleum. No music, no processions. Even the fireplaces seem quieter. Anne stays in her chamber, staring into space. You sit with her, not because she knows you're there, but because no one else dares stay long. One of her ladies in waiting gently braids her hair each morning, and Anne never looks up, just stares, as if trying to see how far she's fallen. Henry avoids her. You follow him instead through courtyards and chapels and into Jane Seymour's presence. Jane is everything Anne is not: quiet, demure, deferential. When Henry speaks, she lowers her eyes. When he jokes, she giggles like it's a hymn. And it works. He begins sending her small gifts: rings, gloves, fruit from the royal orchard. She refuses them. Publicly, graciously. One gift, a jeweled locket, she accepts, but only after Henry fastens it around her neck himself. Inside is a miniature portrait of him. Anne hears about it the same night. She smashes a wine glass. Historians still argue whether Jane was a pawn or a player. Some describe her as manipulated by her brothers who saw an opportunity for power. Others claim Jane herself had learned from Anne's rise and knew how to present virtue as conquest. Quirky tidbit: Jane once returned a gift from Henry by placing it on a prayer book, sending the message that her piety could not be bought. The king predictably was thrilled. Back in Anne's apartments, you notice the shift. She's trying again, wearing brighter gowns, appearing more often in public, sitting beside Henry at council banquets. But it's performative. You see the cracks. She winces when she stands too quickly. Her fingers twitch when Jane enters the room. At one feast, Anne tries to toast Henry. Her voice falters. Jane smiles softly across the table and lowers her eyes. The courtiers freeze. You hear forks pause in midair. Henry smiles at Jane. The room exhales only when the musicians start again. You find Anne later that night in the palace chapel. She kneels alone, whispering words that break on the stone floor. She asks God for strength, for a son, for time. She calls herself unworthy, then catches herself and starts over. And you begin to feel it too, that slow, heavy pull toward something inevitable. Enemies are moving now. You hear it in the corners of council meetings, in the rustling of parchment bearing names: Anne's friends, her allies, her past flirtations, her brother, all gathered in secret lists, assembled by a man now rising fast in Henry's favor, Thomas Cromwell. He watches, listens, smiles just enough to disarm, and then sharpens his blade in ink. Historians debate whether Cromwell acted on Henry's orders or orchestrated the fall himself. Some see him as loyal, others as ruthless. Most agree he was efficient. Anne is surrounded, but she doesn't know it yet. Or maybe she does. She starts asking pointed questions. Why has Sir Henry Norris avoided me lately? What of Mark Smeaton? Why is my brother not invited to supper? One evening, you hear her ask a lady in waiting, "Do you think I've lost him?" The reply is silence. The court begins to turn. Invitations dry up. Eyes dart away. Even those who owe their positions to Anne start drafting alliances elsewhere. And you, you remain close, watching, listening, waiting, because May is coming, and it will not be kind. You awaken to the steady drumbeat of hooves against stone. It's May Day festivities fill the air with cheers and music, but something beneath the celebration feels off. You watch nobles smile too tightly. Dancers move too quickly and courtiers laugh like they're trying to drown something out. The mood smells of flowers and fear. You drift to the royal stands, where Anne and Henry sit side by side watching the jousts. But they might as well be miles apart. Anne is pale but composed, her eyes focused forward. Henry shifts restlessly, his jaw clenched, his hands never still. At one point, he leans over and says something to her. You can't hear it, but she flinches just slightly. Moments later, a knight, the king's groom of the stool, Henry Norris, is called to ride. He drops his lance on the way down the field. Gasps ripple across the crowd. Henry's face darkens, and then just like that, the king rises. Without a word, he walks away, cape dragging behind him, the queen left alone on her throne. Mainstream historical fact. On May 1st, 1536, Henry left Anne at the May Day festivities and rode away. The next day, her musician Mark Smeaton was arrested and tortured into confessing an adulterous affair with the queen. It was the beginning of the end. Back at court, the gears begin grinding in earnest. Thomas Cromwell is orchestrating something now. You feel it in the quiet shuffle of guards and the sudden silences when names are spoken. Mark Smeaton is held in the Tower. By May 2nd, Anne herself is summoned to appear before a council. You're with her that morning. She brushes her hair calmly, chooses her gown carefully, deep crimson. She tells her ladies, "I am the king's true wife, and God knows my heart." She walks to the council chamber with her chin high. Inside, men she once dined with now refuse to meet her gaze. They ask her questions about Norris Smeaton and her brother George Boleyn, about words spoken in jest, about music lessons, about court dances and lingering looks. Historians still argue whether any of it happened. There's no hard evidence, just rumor-coerced confessions and conveniently ambiguous words. But the charges are severe adultery, incest, treason. Fringe detail. The accusation that Anne seduced her own brother may have stemmed from a single conversation, her asking George why Henry had grown cold and whether he thought the king still loved her. That was twisted into conspiracy. You follow her as she's escorted to the Tower of London. She rides in a covered barge, eyes closed, lips moving silently, prayers perhaps are reminders to stay calm. She's lodged not in a dungeon, but in the same royal lodging she once stayed in before her coronation. Quirky irony, the very room where she waited to become queen is now her prison. You move through the tower as she paces. She laughs one moment, cries the next. Her ladies are replaced by spies tasked with observing her every word. She speaks often, even when alone. Not mad, just unwilling to let silence take over. Henry, meanwhile, stays silent. You follow him through the palace where he reviews papers, avoids questions, and meets more and more frequently with Jane Seymour. On May 4th, 2 more men are arrested, Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton. Then George Boleyn, Anne's brother. The charges mount, the web tightens. One day, Anne sits by the window staring out over the Thames. She speaks aloud as if to herself. Did I say too much? Was I too proud? I only ever wanted. She doesn't finish the sentence. On May 15th, her trial begins. You are there, pressed into a corner of the great hall in the tower, surrounded by murmurs and the scrape of boots on stone. Anne stands before a jury of peers, 26 noblemen, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Their faces are carved from stone. Anne defends herself with clarity and precision. She denies every charge. She weaves logic and dignity into every reply. Even the crowd watching the same crowd that once threw flowers listens in silence. Still, the verdict is predetermined. Guilty. Sentence death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. You see Anne's face flicker for just a moment. Then she curtsies and replies, I am the king's true wife, and none but God shall be my judge. You follow her back to her chamber, where she kneels and prays. Then she laughs. I heard the Queen of Scots was worse treated, she says almost casually. At least I shall die with an English sword? But even that is uncertain. Henry delays her execution. Days stretch. 1, 2, 3. Is he reconsidering? Is it mercy? No, he's waiting for the swordsman from Calais. A clean stroke, no axe. Anne prepares herself. She asks for a book of hours. She writes one last note to Henry. No one knows what it said. He never replied. Outside the scaffold is being built. The tower is still in the early morning mist. You hover above the stone courtyard watching the final preparations. The wooden scaffold has been erected just near the white tower, freshly sanded, swept clean, adorned, not with banners, but solemnity. A small crowd is already gathering courtiers, guards, commoners, all pretending this is justice, not spectacle. Anne has risen early. She barely slept. You stayed with her through the night as she whispered prayers, reread the Psalms, and recited phrases from her book of hours. She's calm now. Too calm, some say. But it's the calm of someone who knows the end of the story and is simply walking toward it with her spine straight. Mainstream historical fact: Anne Boleyn was executed on the morning of May 19th, 1536. She was granted the mercy of a French swordsman, known for clean, swift beheadings. Her execution was private compared to others attended by a smaller, hand-picked group. But the weight of the event hung over all of England. You drift beside her as she dresses an English gable hood, this time not her favored French one. She wears a gray gown trimmed with fur, a crimson petticoat, and a cloak of damask. Regal, restrained. Her hands tremble only once when she fastens her girdle. Then she exhales, steadies herself, and smiles faintly. She walks with grace through the tower halls. The guards stand silently as she passes. You think one of them mutters a blessing, but he looks away too quickly to be sure. Fringe tidbit: Annie asked not to wear gloves. She wanted nothing to interfere with the swordsman's stroke. And when asked if she was afraid, she reportedly said, I have heard he is very good, and I have but a little neck. Yes, she really said that. You're at her side as she ascends the scaffold steps. She looks out at the crowd not with fear or bitterness, but a strange serenity. Her final speech is brief. She does not accuse anyone. She does not proclaim innocence. She simply prays for the king's long life, calls him a good and gentle prince, and asks that the audience pray for her soul. Historians still argue why Anne refused to protest. Some say she hoped for a posthumous reversal. Others believe she knew the moment was bigger than revenge. Perhaps she simply chose dignity over spectacle. Quirky detail: she adjusted her coif before kneeling, not out of vanity, but to be sure nothing would hinder the blade. You watch as the executioner, a tall man from Calais brought specially for this task, steps forward. He speaks gently to her. She smiles. He asks her to kneel and to keep still. She does. Then, without warning, he calls out to his assistant to fetch the sword. Anne instinctively turns her head slightly, and that's when it happens. One stroke. No screams, no second attempt. Just the clean sound of a sword slicing through air. Her body slumps forward. Her head drops onto the straw. Silence. The women on the scaffold gasp. One faints. Another begins to sob. The guards remain frozen. The wind finally moves again. You do not look away. Because this is not just the end of a woman. It's the turning point of a kingdom. Anne's remains are placed in an old arrow chest, a makeshift coffin. No monument, no proper tomb. Just a hurried burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula near the scaffold. Henry does not attend. In fact, as Anne's head touches the straw, he is already at another palace preparing to announce his betrothal to Jane Seymour. Yes, that same day, you drift through court that afternoon. No black mourning, no bells, no silence. In fact, the mood is oddly lifted. Men smile more openly. Letters fly back and forth with cautious celebration. One courtier, smug, glint-eyed, says aloud, "The king is free again." Another mutters, "Let's hope the next one breeds better." You want to silence them, but you can't. You're only here to listen. Cromwell walks the halls with a faint smile. His plan worked. Or rather, his storm did. The Boleyn faction is in ruins. George Boleyn is dead. Mark Smeaton, Weston, Brereton, Norris, all gone. But Elizabeth lives. Just a toddler, downgraded from princess to Lady Elizabeth. Stripped of legitimacy, but still alive. You peer into her nursery as a governess straightens her blanket. The child gurgles in her crib, blissfully unaware of what's been lost. Or what she will one day become. Because history has a funny way of choosing its champions. Anne lost everything title, crown, child, future. But she left behind the one daughter who would change England forever. You wander the tower one last time. The straw is gone. The scaffold has been dismantled. But if you listen closely, the stones still remember. The silence here is never quite complete. The court moves on with the eerie efficiency of a machine that's learned to replace parts without pause. You wake into a palace where Anna's name is no longer spoken, at least not above a whisper. Her tapestries are removed. Her falcon emblem scrubbed from the royal plate. Even her motto, "The most happy," is quietly retired. The woman who shook a kingdom has been erased as swiftly as she was crowned. But you remain drifting through the quiet residue of her memory. It clings to the halls, the staircases, the tapestries with slight discolorations where her arms once rested, her perfume once lingered. Some maids still cross themselves when passing her old rooms. Others just don't go in at all. Henry, meanwhile, is jubilant, or pretending to be. 3 days, 3 after Anne's execution, he is formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 17 days later, they're married. 17. You can almost hear Anne's ghost laugh at the speed of it. Henry hosts a celebration subdued by Tudor standards, but smug in its symbolism. Mainstream historical fact. Jane Seymour was crowned queen in May 1536. She would go on to bear Henry, his longed-for son Edward VI, though she died shortly after childbirth. But in this moment, she's perfect. Quiet, obedient, fertile, the anti-Anne in every way. You watch as Jane's family, the Seymours, rise in favor. Her brothers gain titles, land, and seats at the king's table. Anne's relatives, by contrast, disappear. The Boleyn name becomes a cautionary tale. But not everyone forgets. Letters from European courts call Anne's death a murder in all but name. Some refuse to recognize Jane as queen. The Pope fumes. Reformers abroad whisper that Henry has become a tyrant. The Holy Roman Emperor Catherine's nephew grows colder in his diplomacy. Historians still argue whether Henry truly believed Anne betrayed him. Some claim Cromwell manufactured the entire case because Anne threatened his reforms. Others believe Henry wanted out and simply willed the evidence into existence. There's no smoking gun, just a trail of convenient lies, shattered alliances, and the silence of men who knew better. Fringe tidbit. One ambassador reported that Anna's ghost appeared to a kitchen boy in the tower, her head cradled in her arms, asking if the king had repented. The boy reportedly fled and joined a monastery. As you do, you visit Elizabeth next. She's in a small manor now, no longer heir, no longer princess. Her staff is reduced, her clothes are simpler, but she is watched closely. Henry may have wiped Anne from history, but her daughter remains a dangerous little ember. One breath, one spark, and everything could ignite again. Anne had given her gifts a carved coral teether, a mother-of-pearl comb, a miniature Bible inscribed with a verse about wisdom. Elizabeth is too young to understand the value, but one day she will. You float through Parliament, next where laws are reworded, histories rewritten. Anne is formally declared a traitor. Her marriage to Henry is voided as never lawful. Elizabeth, now illegitimate, is struck from the line of succession. The ink dries before the bodies are even cold. Quirky aside, Anne's former chaplain, Matthew Parker, once promised her he'd watch over Elizabeth if anything happened. Years later, when Elizabeth becomes queen, she appoints him Archbishop of Canterbury. Promises like ghosts have long memories. Back in the palace, Jane's influence grows but softly. She doesn't meddle. She avoids the council. She avoids eye contact, really. She's not here to debate or dazzle. She's here to bear a son. You overhear Henry praise her. She is gentle, obedient, not like the last. He doesn't name Anne, he doesn't have to. You pass a servant polishing silver in the hall. She murmurs. At least this one keeps her mouth shut. Another replies, "Aye, for now, because no matter how much is rewritten, the shadows don't forget." The musicians still avoid Anne's favorite lute tunes. The gardens still bloom the tulips she imported from France. One dog, Anne's old spaniel, barks at the Queen's chair and refuses to be near Jane. Superstition, maybe, but even the dogs remember. You return to the tower on a cloudy morning. The scaffold is gone, but a few red petals lie in the dust near the chapel left by someone. A maid? A guard? A ghost? Inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, Anne lies buried beneath the stone floor, her resting place marked only by a small inscription added centuries later. You kneel beside it. There is no fanfare, no monument, just stone and silence. But far across England, in libraries, letters, and memory, Anne lingers, in a bishop's note about her wit, in a scholar's praise for her reformist reading list, in the eyes of a daughter already learning to read before her tutors expect her to, and in you, still drifting, still remembering, still unwilling to let her disappear completely. You awaken now in a quieter England. The fire of Anne Boleyn's final days has burned down to embers, and the court of Henry VIII hums along changed, but pretending not to be. New tapestries hang on the walls. New names fill the court rolls. The Queen is Jane. The king smiles again, though not often, and the court moves forward as if it was always meant to. But you can still feel the ripple Anne left. You wander through Hampton Court, where the ghosts are busiest. The Boleyn apartments are locked, unused, repainted in cooler colors. One maid swears she hears footsteps at night pacing the old nursery. Another won't dust the Queen's gallery alone. She says she hears breathing. You know it's imagination, probably. But you also know Anne Boleyn has never been good at leaving quietly. Henry is busy now consolidating power. His reforms are expanding. Monasteries begin to close their land seized. The Church of England stretches out its new limbs, flexing, breaking, claiming. all in the name of the crown. All because one woman once said no. Mainstream historical fact. The dissolution of the monasteries began in 1536, shortly after Anne's execution. Cromwell, now the king's chief enforcer, engineered the closures with military efficiency. Priories were dismantled. Monks evicted, libraries burned. The king grew wealthier. The realm grew colder. And Jane Seymour, Sweet Jane, walks in Anne's footsteps now. You see her sitting beside Henry, still new to power, still unsure when to speak. She presses him on one issue, just one reconciliation with Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter. Henry resists, but Jane is persistent. Eventually, Mary is allowed back to court, but only after renouncing her mother's marriage and acknowledging Henry as head of the church. You watch her sign the document with a hand that trembles and a heart that doesn't. Mary never forgets who forced her to kneel. Fringe tidbit. Jane once tried to advocate for the restoration of the monasteries. Henry snapped at her so violently she wept in front of the entire court. He later apologized with a ruby brooch. Typical. You visit Elizabeth again. She's growing fast. Red gold hair, 2 large eyes, and a stare that could slice through granite. Her tutors are impressed. Her staff is wary. She already asks more questions than most grown men can answer. One governess reads her a story about a swan that turned into a queen and was beheaded for singing too loudly. Elizabeth listens silently, then asks, "Did the king cut off her head himself?" The governess says no. Elizabeth replies, "But he told someone to, didn't he?" You're beginning to realize Anne never really left. Historians still debate Anne's role in the Reformation. Some claim she was the spark her influence pushing Henry toward Protestantism. Others argue she was a political pawn, clever, but ultimately caught in forces beyond her control. There's truth in both views. But you who followed her every breath know one thing: she changed the game. Even in death. Quirky detail. One French ambassador wrote that Anne had eyes like arrows and words like salt, and warned his successor never to sit too close during banquets. Apparently, she had a habit of asking men how many books they'd read, in Latin. In 1537, Jane becomes pregnant. The court rejoices. Elizabeth is quietly moved to the countryside. No one says it, but everyone knows if Jane bears a son, Elizabeth's relevance fades further. The pregnancy is hard. Jane is pale, weak, confined to her rooms. Henry becomes doting again, hovering, praying, pacing. You recognize the rhythm. Hope, pressure, desperation. He wants his heir. He wants God to agree with his decisions. On October 12th, Jane gives birth. A boy, Edward. The bells ring across England. Bonfires light. Poets are commissioned. Elizabeth's name is not mentioned. Jane dies 12 days later. Henry is devastated, or something close to it. He declares she was his true wife. He wears black for weeks. Her image is preserved, idealized. He will be buried beside her one day. Not Anne, not Catherine, Jane. But you know his grief is tangled. Relief lives in it too. The heir exists. The dynasty is safe. The ghost can quiet for now. And yet, you still see Anne in the flickers of candlelight on the chapel wall, in Elizabeth's curious questions, in the reformers still quoting her influence, in the ladies who wear French hoods even though they're no longer fashionable. You pause in the gardens where once Anne and Henry walked beneath moonlight and lavender. The bench they favored is still there. Carved initials weathered by time. No one sits on it now, except you, and maybe sometimes her. It's been years now, and the court of Henry VIII hums with new music, new names, and new women. But still, Anne lingers. You return to Whitehall, where walls once draped in Anne's silks now bear portraits of Henry's next queens. Jane, of course, followed briefly by Anne of Cleves, whose marriage is so awkwardly brief it barely echoes in the halls. Then Catherine Howard Young, giggling tragically naive. You know how that one ends. Another Anne, another Catherine, another cycle of courtship suspicion collapse. But none leave marks as deep as Anne Boleyn. You glide past a table where two aging courtiers play cards. One jokes. At least this one won't speak French at dinner. The other laughs, but you see something in his eyes. Remembrance, maybe regret. Everyone at court has learned not to say Anne's name aloud, but that doesn't mean they've forgotten her. Henry doesn't speak of her either. Not in public. Not in private. But you see it in the way he watches Elizabeth's tutors, in the silence when Elizabeth's name is mentioned at council. The girl is brilliant, dangerous, a mirror of the mother he ordered killed. Mainstream historical fact. Elizabeth was largely raised away from court but maintained close relationships with scholars including Roger Ascham, who praised her intelligence and rhetorical prowess. She was multilingual before the age of 10 and could debate scripture before her voice had fully settled. Anne's legacy is encoded in every lesson. Fringe tidbit. Elizabeth once scribbled a note in a Latin textbook, "I shall not be moved." She was 9. The handwriting matched one of Anne's surviving letters almost perfectly. Coincidence or blood remembering blood? You trail Henry now as he limps through the gallery, older, heavier, wrapped in furs even during spring. His leg is ulcerated, his breath comes short, his temper grows worse with each year. And yet his mind still sharp when he wants it to be wanders to legacy. He's made mistakes, he knows that, but he cannot admit it. You find him one night alone in the chapel royal. He stares at the candlelight. And for the first time in years, he whispers Anne's name. Quiet, broken, a single word, forgive. He doesn't say more. He never will. But the cracks are there. Anne's brother George dead by false charges. Her allies scattered, erased. Her daughter officially illegitimate, officially ignored, but unofficially watched. One quirky court moment, a minor courtier was dismissed for referring to Elizabeth as the heir. He later claimed it was a slip of the tongue. He spent 3 weeks in the Tower. Yet despite everything, laws, titles, memory manipulation, Elizabeth grows into herself. You see it in the way she moves, the way she observes. She knows how the world treats women with power. She also knows how to make that power untouchable. By 1543, Henry begins to soften politically, if not personally. He drafts a new Act of Succession. In it, he names Edward as heir, then Mary, and then Elizabeth. Mainstream historical fact. This reinstatement did not restore Elizabeth's legitimacy, but it gave her a place in the line of succession. A legal door left slightly ajar. You were in the room when the act was read aloud. The air stiffened. No one applauded. No one questioned it either. That's how you know Anne's legacy hasn't vanished. It's just been hidden in plain sight. You revisit St. Peter ad Vincula on a winter evening. The floor is cold. A single candle flickers by Anne's unmarked resting place. A servant, not knowing you watch, kneels and whispers a prayer for the mother of our future. He doesn't clarify. He doesn't need to. The palace changes again in 1547. Henry dies. There's mourning, yes, but also relief. The court can breathe again. Edward the boy king is crowned. The Reformation deepens. England lurches further from Rome. Anne's ideas once whispered, now stand in pulpits. It's as if her ghost has walked into Parliament and taken a seat, yet her name still isn't spoken. You visit Elizabeth. She wears black not for Henry, but for the world she's now part of. She knows the danger. a teenage girl third-in-line Protestant in a realm uncertain of what it wants to be. But she smiles, that smile, the Boleyn smile. Historians still argue whether Anne planned it all if she imagined this child, this future, this legacy. Some say she believed too strongly in her own invincibility. Others claim she knew she wouldn't survive but hoped her daughter would. You've seen both. You've seen her confidence, her fear, her fury. And now you see her daughter standing at a window spine straight chin high, watching a kingdom that will one day be hers. The wheel turns, the story continues, and Anne, though buried beneath stone, has never truly left. Years have passed like a slow turning page, and you drift through a kingdom ruled by children and caretakers, ghosts and guardians. Henry is gone now, buried beside Jane Seymour as he wished. His rotund figure, his ulcers, his violent moods, gone to history immortalized in oil and stone, but no longer breathing down the necks of his courtiers. In his place, young Edward VI sits on the throne, a boy with sharp eyes, a sharp mind, and lungs too weak for longevity. You linger in the shadows of council chambers where men speak for him through him. The Reformation advances fueled by his tutors, his protectors. Churches are stripped of saints. Latin gives way to English. The world Anne once dreamed of now becomes visible on every altar, and yet she is still not mentioned. Mainstream historical fact. During Edward's brief reign, 1547-1553, Protestantism took a firmer hold. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced. Church services were standardized in English. The Mass was replaced. These were the reforms Anne had privately supported, now adopted without her name attached. But you remember, Elizabeth walks the margins now. Not quite in exile, not quite embraced. She reads, studies, listens. She writes in code, in cipher, in Latin, Greek, French. She plays a long game longer than anyone expects from a girl with no mother, no title, and no secure future. You visit her in Hatfield, where the air is quiet and the rooms are lined with books. She's still young, but already speaks like a diplomat and thinks like a general. The servants speak of her fondly. The nobles speak of her cautiously. One evening you find her staring into a mirror. Her face is calm. Her hands rest lightly on a book, one of Anne's favorites, recovered quietly from the tower by a sympathetic maid. Inside, her mother's handwriting dances across the margins. Elizabeth traces the ink with her finger. Fringe tidbit. One of Anne's surviving books of hours includes a tiny line written by Elizabeth. Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. A child's hand. A daughter's voice echoing through time. And then Edward dies. The court erupts like a chessboard thrown into the air. You watch Lady Jane Grey, a girl no older than Elizabeth, crowned and then uncrowned in the same breath. She lasts 9 days before the axe finds her neck. Mary, Henry's eldest, takes the throne. She is not her father's daughter in body, but certainly in will. Catholicism is restored. Protestantism is labeled heresy, and you feel Anne stir beneath the stones. Because this queen is Anne's oldest enemy's daughter. Mainstream historical fact. Queen Mary Vesper Catherine of Aragon's daughter reversed the Reformation, reinstated papal supremacy, and burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake during her reign. Her efforts earned her the posthumous title Bloody Mary. Elizabeth survives this purge by walking a razor's edge. She attends Mass but whispers Protestant psalms. She praises her sister's wisdom but keeps her own opinions locked behind her eyes. Mary doesn't trust her. How could she? This is Anne Boleyn's child, the girl whose mother replaced hers, who was born of adultery and treason. Mary once told her council that Elizabeth was a bastard sprouted from sin, harsh even by Tudor standards, and yet Mary can't quite destroy her. You follow Elizabeth to the Tower, imprisoned briefly under suspicion of conspiracy. She walks through the same gates her mother entered. She sleeps in the same rooms. She whispers her mother's name just once before curling up in a cloak lined with fox fur and fear. You remain close as she survives. She is released, kept close, kept quiet, watched. And then, 1558, Mary dies. The bells toll not joyfully, but with relief. The kingdom has bled too much. It is tired. It is weary. And Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, is crowned Queen of England. You are there. You float above Westminster Abbey as she steps forward, cloaked in white eyes glinting beneath a crown designed to fit a head that never bowed. She stands not as a princess returned, but as the rightful monarch. Her mother is not named, but she is there in the gold and the light in the eyes of the child-turned queen who was never supposed to survive. Quirky detail. Elizabeth wore a ring engraved with a portrait of her mother hidden inside. She wore it for decades. When it was pried off her corpse years later, Anne Boleyn's face looked up at the world once more. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth honored her mother in public or only in private. But you've seen the truth every word she spoke, every law she passed, every time she stood her ground, was a whisper from Anne. And now the child they called illegitimate rules a kingdom. Anne Boleyn did not live to see it, but she built it. You rise with the dawn mist curling low over the Thames, and somewhere in the distance bells are ringing not to mourn, not to warn, but to mark the beginning of a new reign. Queen Elizabeth now wears the crown, and though Anne Boleyn's name is not spoken at her coronation, you can feel it in the air woven into the tapestry of every ceremonial step. Elizabeth walks alone. She ascends the throne not as a daughter of Catherine or Jane or any queen praised in sermons, but as the impossible child born under scandal, declared illegitimate, nearly erased. Now anointed, she speaks her first words as sovereign. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. The courtiers nod. The nobles bow. But you see it beneath the crown, beneath the measured breath Anne's fire still burns. Mainstream historical fact. Elizabeth's coronation in January 1559 was a deliberate fusion of tradition and quiet rebellion. She rode through the city in a white gown, smiled at commoners, accepted their petitions. Her procession paused at stages where actors reenacted stories of wisdom and mercy, not power and conquest. And inside the abbey, she took communion in English, a signal, a reclaiming, fringe detail. One of the pageants included an allegorical figure labeled Truth, handing Elizabeth a Bible in English. She kissed it. The crowd erupted. Somewhere you imagine Anne's spirit leaned a little closer. You walk with her through the first days of rule. Her advisors are cautious, mostly older men, who think they've seen too much but haven't seen her. She listens, but she also directs. Her mother taught her indirectly how dangerous the court can be. Elizabeth learns from Anne's mistakes. She does not marry. She does not share power. She does not lean too hard on any one man, not even Robert Dudley, not even Cecil. She is charming but never accessible, fierce but never furious in public, measured, always measured. You trail her through meetings where bishops urge her to marry. She smiles and says, "I am already married." To England, it's not just a line, it's armor. Historians still argue whether Anne's rise and fall shaped Elizabeth's worldview. Some say she distrusted intimacy because of what her mother endured. Others argue she saw firsthand the price of ambition and built her reign on caution. Either way, she learned to survive. You walk with her into Parliament, where the push to name an heir looms heavy. She refuses, repeatedly, politely, firmly. "Shall I put my neck in a noose again," she once said, behind closed doors, not to Parliament, but to a lady-in-waiting. The memory of Anne on the scaffold is never far. Quirky detail. Elizabeth had a habit of touching the back of her neck when angry, a nervous tick, some thought. But one of her closest attendants swore she did it only when speaking of trust or betrayal, or when Jane Seymour's name came up. She rules for years, decades. You watch as she strengthens the Church of England, not with violence but with control. The Act of Uniformity passes. Services are held in English. The monarch, once a child declared illegitimate, now becomes the supreme governor of a church Anne only dared dream of. You observe her at Tilbury in armor preparing to face the Spanish Armada. I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she says, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. You smile, because you remember Anne saying once in private, "Why should men have a monopoly on power? We bear kings. Why not be them?" You wander the galleries where her portraits multiply white makeup, red hair, elaborate ruffs. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Astrea. She rebrands herself into myth, but hidden in her private chambers are small reminders. A miniature of Anne in a locked cabinet? A letter from a loyal courtier praising Anne's sharp mind and good counsel. A locket ring on her hand, inside two faces, hers and her mother's. Fringe tidbit. That ring was never removed in life. Only during the embalming after her death did her attendants pry it open. One wept upon seeing Anne's tiny portrait, saying she carried her all along. You stand beside Elizabeth as she grows older. Still commanding, still witty, but more alone. Friends die. The court changes. The sparkle in her eye is harder to summon. But her rule remains intact, unchallenged, legendary. And in her final hours as courtiers gather anxiously, she does not speak of Anne. But she stares out a window toward the tower, toward the chapel where her mother lies beneath cold stone. She doesn't need to say anything. The message is clear. You drift to St. Peter ad Vincula one more time. Anne's resting place is still plain. No golden tomb, no grand inscription, just stone and shadow. But above her the crown now glows brighter. Her daughter did it. Her legacy lives. And for the first time, after all the whispers, all the deaths, all the silence, Anne Boleyn has finally won. It's quiet now. Elizabeth reigns and has reigned for decades. You wander through a palace that has seen more reinventions than most countries. Its walls repainted, portraits replaced, alliances unmade and remade so often they begin to blur. Yet something remarkable has happened. Anne Boleyn's daughter has become the age itself. The Elizabethan era. Not Henrian, not Marian, Elizabethan. You hover near the Privy Council as they debate war trade exploration. England has expanded, ships now return with gold maps and headaches from far-off lands. You hear names like Drake Raleigh Hawkins. There's an empire to build now. Anne would have approved. She always liked men who thought big, though never quite as big as she did. Elizabeth governs from behind fans and masks, behind silken layers of ceremony. But underneath, she's sharp as ever, leaning on her spy network, balancing Catholic Spain, managing Protestant nobles, and keeping Parliament just nervous enough not to push too hard. Mainstream historical fact. Elizabeth ruled from 1558 to 1603, a reign of 45 years, one of the longest in English history. During that time, she never married, never named an heir, and never once allowed anyone to forget who held the pen. You join her in the gardens on a rare day off. She speaks to no one, just listens to the wind. She passes a rose bush and touches a bud lightly. "They don't remember my mother," she says aloud to no one in particular. "Only me." Perhaps that is best, but you know it isn't true. The court remembers. The ladies who sew her gowns, some of their mothers, once whispered stories of Anne. The musicians still avoid playing certain French tunes that used to echo from Anne's chambers. Even the tower guards, gruff and aging, sometimes call the Old North Stairs the Queen's Walk, but never clarify which queen. Anne's presence is not gone, it's just become atmosphere. Fringe detail. An ambassador once noted that Elizabeth wore a ring on her thumb during treaty discussions. When asked about it, she smiled and said, "It belonged to a queen who could not finish her reign. I'll finish it for her." You visit her private study one evening. A fire crackles. A lute leans quietly against a wall, and on her desk sits a single worn letter folded carefully sealed with a faded crest. It's one of Henry's old letters to Anne, the ones filled with longing, rage, hope, and theological rambling. She keeps it not for sentiment, but for study, to understand both her parents, to understand herself. She once told her tutor, "I am what they made, and I am what they feared." You believe it. Historians still argue what kind of Queen Elizabeth was. Some paint her as a cautious moderate. Others call her vain, egotistical, cruel to those closest. But many, even the critical ones, agree she was effective. She ruled with intelligence, resilience, and style. She survived where others didn't. She gave England a golden age and never once apologized for how she got there. Quirky court anecdote. At a mask performance late in her reign, a performer dressed as an allegorical truth declared Elizabeth to be England's mother, chaste and eternal. She stood, smiled, and replied, "My mother was not so lucky, but she was no less true." Gasps, applause, a few stunned nobles. You find yourself returning more often to the chapel now. To Anne, her grave is still modest. Tourists centuries from now will say it's underwhelming, but you know better. The stone is smoother now, the words faint, but the silence there is powerful, because above that grave the entire country has changed. A Protestant queen, an English Bible, a line of rulers no longer tied to Rome. A queen ruling alone, not because she must, but because she chooses to. And all of it, every sonnet, every naval triumph, every palace mask was built on Anne's broken crown. You visit Elizabeth again as the century nears its end. She's aging now. The makeup thickens. The layers of pearl and gold weigh heavier, but she still walks the halls with purpose. Her eyes are tired, but still clever, still calculating. She speaks less of her mother now, but when she does, it's without bitterness, just inevitability. "She was born too soon," she says once, gazing out the window. "I was not." And maybe that's the difference. Elizabeth made the world bend. Anne tried to. The world wasn't ready, but Anne planted the seed. Elizabeth grew it, and you've watched it bloom. The wind has changed again. You can feel it in the rhythm of the court, slower now, more fragile. Elizabeth is aging. The courtiers know it. The nobles know it. She knows it. But she does not yield. She still walks, still listens, still decides. She still holds the center of the storm. Her face is a painted mask, her posture regal, her words measured like coinage. But her steps are smaller, her nights are longer. She sleeps less, speaks less, trusts less. You remain close, your path quieter now, as if you too are waiting for the end of something extraordinary. Mainstream historical fact. In her final years, Elizabeth withdrew more and more from court festivities. She refused to name a successor. She lost many close companions, including Robert Dudley and later his stepson, the Earl of Essex. Her mourning was private but intense. She called herself a shadow of a queen, and yet she never abdicated, not once. You watch as ambassadors press her, who will rule after you? They want certainty. She offers riddles. She calls herself the mother of the nation. She says England shall never be orphaned, but she does not write a name. Because how do you name a successor to yourself? She visits the chapel again late one night, not for mass, not for ceremony, just to sit. The air is damp. Her breath fogs slightly in the chill. Her fingers tremble. She holds a handkerchief laced with her mother's initials. Anne Boleyn's. She speaks so softly you almost miss it. I outlive them all. Fringe tidbit. Elizabeth refused to have her mother's execution spoken of at court, but she commissioned in secret a full genealogy that listed Anne Boleyn as queen consort. A restoration quietly bound in red leather and stored in her private collection. It would be found years after her death. You trail her through the gardens in winter. The trees are bare. She wears white fur, the only color now in a world that seems to be fading. She stops and says, "There will be no more queens like me." And she's right. You drift through Parliament as they prepare for what comes next. James VI of Scotland waits in the wings. Protestant, male, safe. Elizabeth will not name him, but she allows the silence that names him instead. And still she reigns. In March of 1603, Elizabeth takes to her bed. She does not speak much. She lies on cushions fully dressed, refusing a proper deathbed. The archbishop is called, the lords are gathered, but she does not go gently. Mainstream historical fact. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603. She was 69 years old. Her cause of death was never formally determined, but age, stress, and grief had taken their toll. She had ruled England for nearly 45 years. As she slips away, you remain by her side. She stares into the corner of the room. Her lips move. One maid says she sees Anne standing there waiting. Another insists she sees nothing, but you know, Anne has come. Not to take her, but to walk with her. Finally, side by side. Elizabeth exhales, once, then silence. You follow her body draped in velvet surrounded by candles as it moves to Westminster. The bells toll again. The people weep. Nobles bow lower than they ever have. Even her enemies admit she was unmatched. She is buried in Westminster Abbey, and on her tomb finally this inscription, "Consorts both in throne and grave, Elizabeth lies here with Mary, her sister. But her heart, her fire that belongs to Anne? Quirky detail. Beneath Elizabeth's effigy lies a Latin inscription that reads, 'She ruled a kingdom and never married.' But there's a less-known carving tucked into the edge of her tomb, likely added later. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. You return one last time to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. Anne's resting place remains unadorned, but something has changed. Fresh flowers now lie there. A small plaque has been added. Visitors kneel, some weep, some just whisper her name. You kneel too. Because after everything, after the blood, the love, the ambition, the fall, Anne Boleyn has returned. Not in life, not in reputation, but in legacy. She dreamed of power, she bore a queen, and the world remembers. The halls are quieter now, not from absence but reverence. Elizabeth is gone and England exhales long, unsure, bracing itself for what comes next. But you ever lingering, ever watchful, remain behind? Because while the world marches forward with new kings, new wars, new questions, something of Anne still clings to these stones. She no longer needs to haunt. Her legacy now walks freely in daylight. You find yourself back in the tower not during the terror of her fall, but in the echo of its memory. The room where she spent her final days has changed. No guards, no dread, just velvet ropes and quiet tourists. But you remember what was before. You remember the footsteps pacing across the wooden floor, the whispered prayers, the breath caught just before dawn. Mainstream historical fact. Anne's execution site remained unmarked for centuries. Only in the Victorian era was a memorial tablet finally added inside the chapel. Her body placed in an old arrow chest was identified centuries later during renovations by the presence of extra vertebrae in her neck. One final indignity corrected only by time, and now historians have begun to say her name with care. Scholars pore over her letters, her portraits, her marginal notes in prayer books. She is no longer just the second wife, no longer just the downfall of a king. She is a mother, a reformer, a queen whose flame was snuffed too soon but whose spark lit an empire. Fringe detail. In a forgotten corner of a Cambridge library, a volume of Tyndale's New Testament bears the faint imprint of Anne's seal. Likely smuggled, likely read in secret, likely cherished. You wonder if Elizabeth ever turned those pages too. You walk beside modern historians now quietly listening as they debate Anne's faith. Some claim she was a Protestant heroine. Others suggest she was more politically savvy than devout. A few raise eyebrows at the idea that she believed anything except ambition. But you who have watched her cry behind closed doors and smile beneath pressure know better. She was not simple, she was not safe, and she was never sorry. Elizabeth's reign brought Anne's dreams to life, yes, but it did not bring her vindication. That would take longer. Decades, centuries. And even now the argument isn't over. But at least it's being had. You visit Hever Castle, Anne's childhood home. The gardens are pristine, the moat still, the air rich with old roses. Her books are on display, her bed restored, her initials still carved into a stone windowsill half concealed by ivy. You smile. She never stopped leaving marks. A young girl stands in her room reading the display plaque. She doesn't blink as she whispers the name Anne Boleyn. Then she whispers another Elizabeth, and you see the connection click behind her eyes. You drift to Westminster where the great tomb of Elizabeth lies raised in marble and gilt. Her effigy rests in quiet dignity. But she is not alone. Beneath her sealed in stone are the remains of Mary I, the half-sister she both loved and feared. Irony in death. United at last though history drove them apart. Still somewhere deeper behind the carvings and the stone. Anne's daughter rules forever. Quirky modern twist. Every year on the anniversary of Anne's execution, visitors leave flowers at the tower. Not just British ones. French tourists, American school teachers, historians from Seoul, feminist scholars from Sao Paulo. The language varies. The meaning doesn't. A note once read, "She walked so her daughter could run." You stand at the edge of the chapel listening, and then you hear it. Not voices, not footsteps, but a single line spoken as if in wind. "Do you still remember me?" And you do. Of course you do. Time has taken Anne far beyond scandal now. You float above the centuries that followed, where she has moved from condemned queen to contested legend to cultural icon. Her story picked apart and reassembled again and again by artists, authors, historians, and dreamers. She is studied, dramatized, fictionalized. Every generation tries to remake her in its own image. Some succeed. Some fall spectacularly short, but none can leave her alone. You wander through a modern library now, watching fingers trace her name on book spines. The other Boleyn girl, Anne Boleyn, a new life. The life and death of Anne Boleyn. Some romanticize her. Some vilify her. Some try to rescue her. No one can resist her. Mainstream historical fact. In recent decades, historians have begun revisiting Anne's story with sharper tools and a more skeptical eye. Scholars like Eric Ives, Ratha Warnica, and Alison Weir have re-examined her downfall, often rejecting the old tropes of the seductress or the witch. Instead, they find intelligence, strategy, vulnerability, and tragedy. You watch reenactments, Stage plays, documentaries, actors in French hoods trying to capture that cool, sharp defiance. Some get close, others are more mascara than monarchy, but each time another person learns her name, and that matters. In classrooms, school children debate whether she was a feminist before her time or a pawn of the men around her. In pubs, tourists whisper about the tower, imagining her last words. On TikTok, snippets of her story flicker in 30-second edits, paired with orchestral swells and text that reads, "She didn't lose. She changed the world." You hear laughter, tears, indignation, all from strangers who never met her, yet swear they understand her. Fringe tidbit. One of Anne's original signet rings, thought lost for centuries, was discovered in a private collection in the 1990s. The initials AB interlocked with a falcon crowned and poised. It now rests behind glass. Visitors queue just to glimpse it. But you remember the hand that wore it. You return to the tower again. It looks different in the electric light, but the stones remain unchanged. The chapel is cleaner, quieter. A guide tells the crowd she was buried here hastily without ceremony. Just a name carved later. They nod. Some cry. One child no older than 7 asks, "Why did they kill her?" The guide fumbles. You watch. And then the child says, "But she had a daughter who became queen anyway, right?" Yes. Yes, she did. And here's the truth. Anne's legacy is no longer only about the crown she nearly wore or the man who broke kingdoms to claim her. It's about the daughter who rose from ashes. It's about the fire that was meant to be extinguished, but still glows centuries later. In museums, her letters are studied for their tone. In university lectures, her theology is debated. In novels, her motives are imagined. In feminist discourse, she is hailed as an early emblem of the costs women pay for speaking too clearly, for standing too firmly. One quirky cultural echo. A 21st century rock opera cast Anne as the lead voice in a rebellious chorus of Henry's wives. She opens the show. She owns the spotlight. The girls cheer. The boys nod. The historians cringe slightly, but smile anyway. You drift above the audience. They all know how her story ends, and they still want to hear it. That's the power now, the enduring pull. Anne, once buried in haste, now lives in the imagination of millions. Not as a victim, not even as a queen, but as a force. You return to her grave one more time. It is no longer lonely. There are flowers, notes, ribbons tied around the railing. One reads, "You didn't lose, he did." Another, still the most happy, you smile. Because history, though slow, has finally caught up. You float now in the in-between where past and present blur. And Anne Boleyn exists not as woman or myth, but something stranger, fuller. You've walked her timeline from first glance to final breath, and now you walk through how she endures not just in facts and footnotes, but in feeling. Because to study Anne is to confront contradiction. She was ambitious but religious, calculating yet emotionally raw, political but deeply personal. Her story resists simplification, and that's why it still compels. You pause beside a theater stage where her story plays out yet again. The actress wears the French hood with practiced grace, her voice poised between confidence and vulnerability. The audience leans forward, not because they don't know how it ends, but because they want this time to be different. It never is, but somehow each telling keeps her alive. Mainstream historical fact. The debate over Anne's guilt or innocence continues, though most modern scholars agree the charges were politically motivated. Her enemies needed her gone. Her husband needed a son. Her fall was not justice, it was expediency wrapped in ritual. Still, the fascination remains. You watch as a university lecture compares Anne to figures like Joan of Arc or Marie Antoinette, women placed at the center of cultural upheaval whose deaths meant more than their lives ever could have while they breathed. One student asks, was she a feminist? The professor hesitates. She was a woman who refused to accept the limits of her time. You'll take it. Fringe detail. Anne's motto, the most happy, has reappeared on protest signs, t-shirts, even tattoos. For some, it's a reclamation of defiance. For others, a reminder of irony. But for all, it's a name whispered across generations, the Queen, who almost was, and yet still is. You drift beside a writer tapping out a new biography paragraphs weighed down by nuanced humility and admiration. They debate whether to open with her trial or her childhood, whether to include her laugh, her fluency in French, the precise color of her eyes. You already know they were dark, very dark. Not black, but deep brown rimmed with amber when the light caught them. Noted by friends, remembered by enemies, you've seen them blink in fear, narrow in anger, soften in awe as she held her daughter for the first time. And now those same eyes gaze back from portraits of Elizabeth, the tilt of the chin, the watchfulness, the flame. You return again one last time to the chapel in the tower. It's dusk. The stained glass glows red and gold. No guards, no torches, just time and stone and silence. And the name Anne Boleyn. Not mistress, not concubine, not adulteress, not witch. Queen, mother, architect of an age. You kneel beside the stone. A tourist nearby does the same. She says nothing, just lowers her head, rests a hand lightly on the slab. Her face is peaceful, her eyes closed. And then she whispers, "Thank you." Not for anything specific, just thank you. You rise. Because this story, like all good ones, doesn't truly end. It echoes. In music, in books, in questions, in courage. In the glance of a daughter standing alone and unafraid. Anne Boleyn was never truly queen, and yet she rules still. The sun sets now for the last time in this long, quiet retelling. Not a sunset in history or in legacy, but in your own gentle passage through Anne's world. You've walked with her from whispered flirtations in glittering halls to bare stone beneath the axe's edge. You've stood beside her daughter as the world forgot her name, and then slowly, carefully began to remember. And now, it's time to rest. You find yourself back where it all began, in the court of Henry VIII, before the letters, before the coronations, before the thunder of betrayal. The music floats faintly, the light dappled through tall windows, and there she is, Anne, not yet crowned, not yet doomed. Just alive in the full fire of her cleverness and her ambition. Laughing, watching, waiting, you no longer need to follow. You've seen it all. Because Anne Boleyn is not merely a woman of her time, she's something rarer. A woman who refused to vanish, who would not be reduced, who lost everything and left behind everything that mattered. Mainstream historical fact. Anne Boleyn's execution set in motion events that altered the structure of England permanently. The Church of England, the Elizabethan Golden Age, the very DNA of English identity all bear fingerprints of a woman who never reigned in peace but never stopped shaping the storm. Fringe tidbit. In recent years, DNA analysis of bones believed to be Anne's has confirmed her physical anomalies. The extra fingernail, the slightly elongated neck vertebrae, for centuries used as signs of witchcraft. Now, just part of her. Evidence she lived, that she was real, that she was human. You leave the tower behind its walls, now a museum. But not sterile. They breathe with memory. You pass a group of girls tracing Anne's story in a guidebook. One whispers she was brave. Another says she was clever. A third, they were scared of her. Exactly. Quirky echo. A school play in a small town opens with Anne staring into the audience. No crown, no executioner. Just her voice, "I was not born to be forgotten." You smile. Because now she never will be. The world she lived in tried to silence her. Time let her speak again, and you were there to listen. And now, as the final candles gutter low in the memory of a woman who burned too bright, let yourself settle. Let your breath slow and your mind soften. You've traveled far across centuries of power and passion, betrayal and brilliance. You've stood in rooms where crowns were won and lost. You've heard prayers whispered in dark corners. You've watched love turn to danger and danger shape destiny. Let the images drift now. The lace of Anne's sleeve trailing over a velvet cushion. The hush of a council chamber as her name is pronounced for the last time. The quiet pride in a daughter's eyes ruling the kingdom that killed her mother. Let them fade into the warm haze of memory. You don't need to remember every detail. Just hold the feeling, the stillness, the truth that sometimes the most lasting power does not come from thrones or armies or laws, but from the echo of one voice refusing to vanish. So lie back, let the world slow around you. There's nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove. You were here, you heard her, that's enough. Let the silence now be gentle, let it be kind, and let sleep come like a velvet curtain, slow and soft. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.